We hope you enjoy listening to this podcast of St. Louis on the Air, brought to you by University College at Washington University, with undergraduate and graduate programs part-time, evening, and online. University College at Washington University, offering world-class education within reach.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Marsh. Bitter cold winter weather is on its way, and that means the city and private organizations are scrambling to get ready to help homeless people living in the streets. How well along are they? We're talking about it with Irene Agustin, the St. Louis Director of Human Services. She's in studio. Teka Childress is the founder of St. Louis Winter Outreach. She's with us by phone. Her organization helps provide resources for the homeless in wintertime. Thank you so much for being with us, Irene. Great to have you. Teka, good to have you with us.
Don, thanks for having us. Really grateful to talk about this topic.
Well, let's start talking about it then. Irene, I'll start with you. How many homeless people are out there on the streets, do you think, in St. Louis today?
So according to our last point-in-time count, which happened last January, between St. Louis City and St. Louis County, we had a little over 1,300, both in shelter and on the street. On the street, according to the count, we had about 140 between St. Louis City and St. Louis County that were counted.
Are there accommodations for all of them when the weather gets cold?
I would say that's why we have to partner with our community volunteers and faith communities, because if someone's facing a housing crisis, some of them are in shelter or on their way to permanent housing, but with homelessness, it's kind of fluid within our community because housing crisis, people can face that. If they were living in an apartment and they were evicted, that causes someone to be homeless. If they have a medical issue and were discharged from the hospital, that could cause someone to be homeless. There's various reasons why someone would face a housing crisis.
How well does the city work with the county, for instance, on these problems? There's no wall between the two, obviously, and people drift back and forth.
Yeah, and it's just not only with St. Louis County, it's trying to work with the rest of our region. I would say that with St. Louis, and part of this is the fragmentation within our community that makes it difficult to have some of these conversations. A lot of work has been done over the course of the last 2 years to sit down with our counterparts, not only with St. Louis County, but St. Clair, Madison, and St. Charles County, to really look at homelessness as a region. There's a lot more work that needs to happen because, even today, a lot of that responsibility is put on to the city of St. Louis. And looking at our population in relation to the rest of the region, it's very difficult to be in that position, but we can't do it without our regional partners.
I've talked to the mayor about this, and I've talked to your predecessors about this with regard to their concern that the county could be doing more because, a lot of the problem here comes from the county.
I mean, certainly, if you're looking at population and people facing housing crisis, we're looking at 330,000 residents in the city of St. Louis versus, 1.2 million in St. Louis County and more in other parts of the region. And so in doing that, we have to have these conversations as a region. Someone facing a housing crisis may have started in the county but have found their way to the city. So it's something the city can't do alone.
And these conversations going well?
And so I would say part of what was created was the St. Louis Area Regional Commission on Homelessness, which brought all these partners to the region to at least start talking. And I would say that's really history in the making because we've never sat down just on homelessness with our counterparts. And now we're talking about ways and actions we can do together to reduce and end homelessness. But these are just the starts of talks. There's much more that all of us can do together.
Right. Teka, thank you for being patient as we kind of set up our discussion here with Irene. How are you gearing up for what's to come?
Well, could I first respond to something on the question of numbers of people on the street, if that would be okay?
Sure, of course.
It's our experience that there's hundreds of people on the street. I was part of the point-in-time count last year. And to give an example of the difficulty of that count, HUD requires a lot of information to be gathered from each person. I was on a place in North St. Louis where a number of people came flooding out of abandoned buildings to meet us, and we were surrounded by people. And I was only able to count 4 because of the information I had to gather, but I was surrounded by 12 to 15 people. So I really think it's an inaccurate count, first of all. And then additionally, if we look at last year, after we had people at Biddle, we had people in Salvation Army and its winter beds that they open up just during the winter. We had people in the Grace and Peace beds where they take women during the winter. We still had, I think, around 250 to 260 people just in our winter shelters. And so I believe that we have quite a number of people out there who are out that we aren't accounting for. And the problem with that is that I believe at best we have maybe 160 beds on our best night, but on our worst night we only have about 60 beds available, plus the 51 that are being added at Biddle. So I believe we're way short on beds for this winter, and I'm very concerned about that. So I've been really glad to partner with the city and other people who are working on this. I believe it takes all of us. But it's shameful to leave people outside. It's not only a risk for their life on a day-to-day basis when it's cold, and they can die from the cold. And St. Louis Winter Outreach started because I was with a man who ended up dying because I wasn't able to get him inside. Oh. And so just to say, though, that not only are people dying from the cold, but they're dying in spirit and heart, living out there all year long.
Irene, do you want to react to that, particularly with the number, the count?
Mm-hmm. And so, and I know Teka, and we work very closely together as well. And I admire her passion for this. And, we've had debates on the numbers in itself. And I think one of the important things, and Teka alluded to this, the point-in-time count's just a snapshot for that night. And I think where we can work together better as a community is to get more real-time data in terms of how people inflow into our homeless service delivery and outflow, meaning they get connected to permanent housing. But that requires a lot of work to put those data elements together and to work as a region, because we know people may start in St. Louis County but may float in, across the river to St. Louis. And some of the best practices that are out there are with community solutions built for zero. How do we get to that high quality by name list of the folks that we know are within our community? And so, there's always going to be a debate in terms of the numbers until we can make that conscious effort to get that straight. But in terms of the beds, and that's why, and I would say St. Louis Winter Outreach is very dedicated to what they do. And they're awesome. And it's awesome for our community to have such dedicated faith community and community volunteer members at that. And I know they work very hard to the churches that come together to open up shelters during the winter season. To pull all those volunteers together is a lot of work. And I know that with our group, with the city, and with our partners in the St. Louis County, we're looking, and I think this prompted even more discussion in terms of the emergency shelter beds within our regular system.
We're going to get more beds?
And so Monday, St. Louis County opened up their warming shelter for the year, and that added 45 new beds. But upon, even discussing the beds, it's making those intentional referrals too. Some of the things that we saw from last winter, not everyone was homeless. And I wouldn't say that it's a majority of people. There are people that are facing housing crisis. But if you had a utility shut off and you're living in a home and it's cold, you would prefer to be somewhere where it's going to be warm. And so how do we do a better job of getting other resources to folks so that they never find themselves in that situation? And so there's a lot, and bringing to the discussion our community volunteers along with, our other providers to really move in the same direction so we can start to reduce to end homelessness within our community. And so that means we have to have these discussions about the data, and we have to have these discussions about what services we do have in our community.
Teka, you sound like you want to get into this. Go ahead.
I do. It's just what, and data is very important, and it's good to gather. We are seeing, though, a lot of people outside all the time and in buildings. Our people are out every night seeing people outside. It's irrefutable how many people that we are seeing a lot of people outside, and there's so many people we aren't seeing. There are neighborhoods we don't even get to. So that brings me to my point is I'm part of a group that's just forming called the St. Louis Housing Forum, and it came out of kind of an offshoot of Winter Outreach. We had a big summit, and now we're having a forum where we can gather people together to keep looking at new ways of solving this problem. And one of the things my team of this group is looking at is trying to gather people together who would open some shelters. And Irene and I have talked about this a lot. Our dream is really to open small neighborhood shelters where maybe we'd have apartments nearby where people could rent. We'd have churches and synagogues and communities nearby that would support the shelter. There'd be a place for people to go during the day where they could go when they need a place to stay. Maybe even have tiny houses in a neighborhood where we'd start building small communities where we could get people back into our neighborhoods. Not, huge shelters, but small community shelters all throughout the city. But one of the goals we have coming up soon is to get some new shelters open. And we will be asking the city and county to help us financially on those. We've had many churches and groups that have opened shelter on a shoestring budget they couldn't afford. And so we're going to ask the city to come up with more because, and this is not Irene's fault. I admire Irene so much because she came to St. Louis and brought the Housing First model and has been a great inspiration for us. But the city as a whole has only, I think it's 0.03% of its budget toward human services and 56% toward public safety. That is a really cynical way to view human life. We need a public safety net that protects our brothers and sisters who, many of whom are in their situation completely without any fault of their own because of all kinds of gentrification, zoning laws, racism, things that have just pushed people to the edge. And we all have a responsibility to bring them back into our community, to welcome them back, to provide for them. So we will be hoping to open some shelters, and I believe we need to do this as a way of moving people from shelter to permanent housing. Irene is a strong supporter of permanent housing, and this is kind of a discussion that she and I have had ongoingly.
I wonder, Teka, if I can just follow up on something you said. If it's realistic to expect people in neighborhoods to, open properties that might be available to homeless people. I think of the outcry on Washington Avenue about residents there that were concerned about homeless people and, on the streets and doing things on the streets that were, not very advantageous for the neighborhood. Is it realistic to expect the public to accept this?
Well, and that's a great question. And so that's why I believe in small shelters of 15 people that then, that where there's a lot of support and have people in the neighborhood as part of, in relationship with the people. We've actually opened up some houses that are small shelters in different neighborhoods that we convert to permanent housing at the end of the winter. Winter Outreach has already been doing this, called a CC House, and they've been very successful and in most cases extremely advantageous to their neighbors, and because there's strong support in the house for the people there. And we deal with issues like people struggling with substance use disorder. We address those issues, and you do it in a small way with small numbers. And so instead of having one huge shelter where all people who are unhoused or living in one place without or outside with nowhere in our parks and under bridges, instead of that, we could have them in small settings throughout the city and county. That's the idea. And it's asking people to come and meet folks, to get to know them. They are us. They are no different than us. People in our neighborhoods have substance use disorders. They're just doing it in their home.
Right. Irene wants to respond to some of the things you said, so let's let her.
And in terms of, and I look at it from neighborhoods better supporting the residents in it, because people become homeless for various reasons, economics, mental health, whatever, but it's the support they get. If they can't get it from their family, what can they get from their community and from their neighborhood? And what I would like to see, not only in the city but in the county, is how do our neighborhoods better support people faced with whatever crisis that is? And it may not be shelter. It may be connection to prevention services, like helping with a utility payment or rental assistance. And I think we can work together to better equip neighborhoods to be able to be that safety net so someone doesn't have to find themselves going to a large-scale shelter. But that requires more discussion about that, and not only with the city but with our regional partners as well.
What are the big policy fixes? We have an email from Sarah asking pay more attention to the big policy fixes that are necessary. What are they?
Well, so one of the things that in Teka's group, and I don't remember what she called it, but it came
Housing
about
Forum.
from the Housing Forum, is we are looking at policy. And some of that policy is on how do we address emergency needs, and some of that policy is on how do we support affordable housing within our communities. So if we have a new housing development, is there a way to support affordable housing in that so a neighborhood doesn't become gentrified? There's various things that I know through the auspices of that group that we're working with. And there's people that represent the real estate community, that represents government, that represents providers that are coming to figure out what these policies are so it best meets the needs of our community.
You want to respond to that, Teka?
No, I think that there's so many great policy changes we could make. The one of the things that's complicated is that often the solutions we use to meet problems deal with the very end of them. So you are trying to get people off the street, but the issue is why are people on the street to begin with? And we have a whole economic system and a lot of other things that have caused people to be on the street. And so it's difficult without people. So one of the solutions is affordable housing. So one of the solutions we have to find is we either have to make sure people have enough income, that we have just wages. We either have to make sure that housing is affordable so they can pay it, or we have to find subsidy. We have one of those three things for people to be able to live in housing and pay for housing. We have to have enough housing that is affordable. So that's where gentrification comes in. If you get rid of affordable housing and you have housing that's very high end, it's very hard for people who don't have enough income. So one of the solutions, I always like to say we have a crisis with unhoused people and a crisis of homelessness, but there are hundreds of things we can do. And one of them would be the tiny house is one solution in small numbers because it's a more affordable type of housing.
All right, I'm going to have to stop. I'm sorry, Teka, to have to stop it there, but our time is up. We'll have to expand this conversation as the winter progresses. Irene Agustin, thank you so much for being with us. There's more to talk about, obviously. She's the Director of Human Services in the city, and Teka Childress is the founder of St. Louis Winter Outreach. We'll put a link to your organization on our website, Teka, so folks can learn more about you and volunteering to help you. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.